Good afternoon, everyone. I wasn't actually waiting for that, but thank you, Heather. So we're really excited about this part of today's session because now what we're going to do is hear back from all of the groups of what were the most interesting findings and highlights of the discussion that you had. And the format that we'll be using is we'll have the folks from Rockefeller Foundation who are in all of those breakouts come up and share with you the report outs on the ideas, the applications, and the pathways. We'll then turn back to you, and we encourage you, if you're in a breakout and there are some ideas that you felt were really interesting that maybe weren't reported back on that you thought would be useful to share with the group, please feel free to do so, and we'll explore some other themes as well. And then we'll bring the discussion back here as we think about, well, how are we analyzing this? How are we synthesizing this? Because ultimately what we'll be doing is we'll be taking some of this great discussion back and thinking about how do we incorporate this into the work we do so we can advance some of these ideas. And I was told to provide a teaser of the report that'll be coming out. So what I can say is it's going to be a very exciting, very cool report. And that's all I'm going to say. So you should stay tuned for it. And we also look forward to sharing with you the progress on the work that we'll be doing in advancing some of the ideas, as Dr. Roden mentioned this morning, about what and how we pursued ideas from the first forum. So, Mark, maybe, actually I should have mentioned I'm Zia Khan, the Vice President of Strategy and Evaluation at the Foundation. And I'll turn over to my colleague Mark now to help us facilitate through.
I'm Mark Erzon, and I helped design this facilitation process with my colleagues from the Rockefeller Foundation. Could we have our 4 content moderators come up? You should recognize them. And what we've asked each of the content moderators to do is to summarize the first breakthrough idea that you all came up with that was your top vote getter, to also say something about the idea that they personally felt was a really out-of-the-box and powerful idea, and then to just share a word about what was the process like in the room. Because I know from previous events that we've done that this one was in many ways very exciting, and you were able to go deeper because you're going into one specific area for an hour and 45 minutes. And I know there was a lot of depth that happened, so I'm hoping we can capture some of that. And then as Zia said afterwards, after you hear the 4 reports, we're going to listen to you all say what else happened that needs to be said in the larger group. And we have handheld mics that we'll pass around to each of you. Okay? So with that, let's start with Ben and Group 1.
Evening, I'm Benjamin de la Peña. I'm Associate Director for Urban Development. I was with Group 1. We took up DIY technologies with Limor Fried. Here's the first idea. Oops, this is not what we had. Okay, the first one I'll take up. It's an amalgamation of this. It's called Tech Translator Open Source Engineering Circles. And what was interesting about this is we took not the gadgets, but the ability to share information. And what the room was very conscious of was, even if it was a very eclectic room, that we didn't really know what the problems of the poor really were. They needed to define that. What we needed to duplicate were engineers going out there, learning from each other. And we had someone from Engineers Without Borders, and we wanted to clone him, but also to clone that knowledge. And a way to do that by developing all of this knowledge, making it available, making sure it's contextualized so that it's translated both in terms of concepts, but also translated in context so that communities, it answers the needs of communities. The other one was not safety in water, although that came very close. Am I supposed to go to the first one and the pathway first, or?
However you want to do it.
Okay, it wasn't safety in water, it was very close. The second one was about motivation and learning badges. And the idea was, can we develop an alternative currency or reward system where people like, for Limor to be able to share what she knows, it's because she lives in a first world and she can kind of afford to do that. Is there a way to reward people for sharing ideas? And the open source movement has this in terms of karma for what you can contribute. But is there a more real way to do that in ways that people can use their rewards for other things? The other part of it was, is there a way to develop alternative learning systems so that as you learn to work on these gadgets, you are rewarded with a badge that then leads you into livelihood? In terms of pathways, the big challenge on the translator was engineers, apparently, and this is from Limor, one of the worst things that engineers do is document. They hate documenting. There is no financial incentive for them to document. So some of the pathway ideas were, let's pay for, let's have fellowships for manual writers, or have video instructionals that come part of the work is that they show how they're doing things, or some sort of Wikipedia or WikiHow of how you do something, an iFixit that shows you in very clear pictures how things are put together, a philanthropedia that says these are the approaches that work, and then that's brought together with circles of learning. In terms of the pathway for motivation and learning badges, it's how do you figure out what the value is of these rewards? What is the currency really, and what do I get back in turn from it was one of the questions. But in the same way that currencies balance out depending on demand and supply, there must be a way to figure this out. It needs some thinking. So those are your two ideas.
Great. And could you just say a word about the process in the room and who your rapporteur and facilitator was?
Our facilitator was Simon Marks. Is he here? And our rapporteur was Michelle Tall. Did very good work. The process was good. We had a very eclectic group, but we had people from Google, someone from Engineers Without Borders, someone from Creative Time, someone from Blue Circle. But what was very clear, the first concern they said was, we don't really understand what the problems may be, and they understated that we didn't have spent enough time with the poor. A lot of them did. But that was the primary concern, that the solutions, the problems have to be defined by the urban poor themselves, or the poor, before we come up with solutions.
Thank you, Ben. Kippy.
Thank you. So the group that I was in spent some time considering the 3D printer, and we had the opportunity to have not a printer itself, but another version of a prototype in the room to inspire us. The idea that the group selected, and that we in some ways merged some of the other ideas into, the first one, was the idea of cyclical cooperative production. So there's a lot there. We kind of front-loaded the title. But the ideas are fundamentally about, sorry, I just want to make sure this is, yes, creating a generation of makers, so that when we're talking about communities, whether they're in the developing world or the developed world, there is the capacity there to think creatively and to innovate with tangible products to change the way that we address the pressing social need in front of us. The idea of a 3D printer is really about manufacturing, so we broadened the theme to think about localized manufacturing. And what is manufacturing besides assembling parts? So the idea that we could create replacement parts, or that we could recycle and reuse existing pieces that had maybe broken down captured our imagination, and we allowed ourselves to riff on that for a while. The other piece of this was in terms of the pathway, was the key element of identifying priorities collectively in a community, and then being able to use these kinds of technologies, the printer and such, to do manufacturing of what is needed for the whole, the group. Another pathway piece was around the opportunity for micro-entrepreneurship that would allow for creation of livelihood and sustaining of livelihoods to be developed around this new manufacturing technique. The group thought about applications of alternative energy, like thin film solar, and the pieces to create wind power that could be created by this printer itself. And so we had spent some time kind of going off in the hinterlands of the actual tangible applications. But we came back to a term that we coined, restrutable. Is a material able to be made by something like a 3D printer? Because there are concerns about toxicity and about also the energy costs of production. You don't want to be recycling something if the whole package then is not exactly reducing your use of energy for its function. The second one that we chose, that we highlighted, and this was really a consensus by the group, was the use of the 3D printer or local manufacturing techniques for disaster scenarios, both building resilience to those as well as recovering from those. In any disaster scenario, we're talking about three main things: food, water, and shelter. Or nutrition, water, and shelter. And in this case, we're not expecting that the 3D printer will produce no-kill meat and solve the nutrition factor there, but for the shelter piece, could be pretty critical. But equally, what's important in these kinds of scenarios is coordination and communications and conduits or conveyance for materials to get from a port to the individuals that need it, and the printer could be useful there. So the last key piece in my remaining seconds is that it's also useful for improvising and prototyping. So we're not just talking about creating boards to create prefab housing, but what if you have some existing prefab housing that needs a different kind of joint? The 3D printer is right there to use it, to develop it for you. My facilitator was Dale Pfeiffer. She did a great job keeping our group on track. And our typist extraordinaire, who also served as a facilitator, was Carolyn Bancroft, whose fingers were worn to the bone, so we thank her for that. And I just want to say that I was personally so struck by the willingness of the participants, who are all experts in their own right, to come into the room and really engage with a spirit of brainstorming, positivity, and openness. We spent very little time on the barriers or the how this could not happen, and most of our time on what the benefits for the poor could be.
Thank you, Kippy. Evan.
Thanks. So, my name is Evan Michelson. I'm an associate director and the research team at the foundation, and I was in the no-kill meat group. We sort of called it No Kill Meat and Beyond. So I want to start first by thanking our facilitator, which was Nick Jankel from We Create, who really kept the energy up in the room and really kept us on task, and Amira Ibrahim, who had an extremely challenging job capturing the 20 ideas that we collected and then whittling it down. So they were quite impressive. And I'll start with a reflection about the process. I think our group really came together with some valuable interdisciplinary perspectives. We had architects, international relations experts, people with expertise in water, public engagement in science, and that really showed in the thinking that came through. And I was excited by the wide ranging of ideas that we came up with, everything from no-kill fish to a notion around edible architecture, which feel free to talk to people in the group that came out. That came up with it. So the first idea that we came up with is really around a process innovation, which we termed prime cuts across sectors. So this was this really interesting idea that there are actually people working not just on no-kill meat around issues of improved nutrition in the developing world, but also around things like single-cell organism research, biofuels research, algae research. So there's this really interesting suggestion that you need to create a new set of community that thought not just about the food dimension of this, but the energy dimension as well, and really thought quite deeply about that. The second innovation, or the second application that we thought about, was this notion of meter bots. So we maybe went where Kippy's group didn't, but really thought about combining the notion of localized production of food that really we thought could be useful in a number of dimensions. First of all is that there's the potential opportunity to integrate more nutritious food into people's diets by injecting nutrients into no-kill meat. And we thought if you could actually combine that with the localized production that we heard about earlier, you might have some really interesting innovations that happen. So on the pathway side, particularly around the process innovation, we thought about the need to create new interdisciplinary research communities, the need to create incentives for the private sector that doesn't just look at specific food production sources, but also around energy systems, and the desire to really think about unintended consequences across different dimensions. So not just thinking about what would happen if you spread no-kill meat, but also what if you could actually think about this in relationship to other sectors that might emerge in the economy. On the product side of the innovation, so on the MeterBot side, again, we thought there would be interesting ways to think about delivery modes and distribution channels that could either follow existing distribution channels or create new ones. We thought that it would be really interesting to think about new forms of training and education. So could you do TED-style training processes that would teach people actually how to use these new technologies that combine localized production and food creation? and also that there might be interesting ways to finance the creation and the purchase of these types of products. So it wasn't just a question about sort of culture and people creating their own food and reframing that problem, but really about thinking through how do we actually get these technologies into people's hands.
Beautiful. Thank you, Evan. Ashwin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashwin Dayal, and I'm the Rockefeller Foundation's Managing Director for Asia, so I'm normally based in Bangkok. It's great to be here. First, just our facilitator was Andy Nagoski from East West Institute. I don't know if Andy's in the room, but did a great job at trying to keep us on track in what was a fairly broad subject area. And then my colleague Susan Kagondu, who was helping with the documenting of this discussion. We came up with, as I'm sure every group did, with a lot of diversity in terms of the ideas. And I think when you're looking at the question of data and sensing within an urban environment, it was, these things, these 20-odd ideas kind of fell into a number of clusters around how do you use data to enhance accountability. Something that the poor and vulnerable care a lot about is what is their relationship with the state and how can information help them transform that relationship into something that delivers more accountability to them, whether it's for services or for something else. Another area was around sort of the whole question of how data can be used to drive behavior change, how better information can be pulled together to allow any topic, whether it's to do with environmental awareness or something else, how do you actually get public action, public behavior going and changing. So a lot of different ideas, but really falling into a few categories. We honed in on two in particular. The one that was chosen by the group was on the theme of grassroots education. And this also brought a couple of concepts together. But it was really the question is, how do you use the availability of data to drive education and learning that is driven by communities, that leverages the technology to enable sort of relevant and collaborative user-driven learning as well as action. And by that I mean sort of two things. One was this notion that technology, really the application of technology has to be determined by communities themselves, for what purpose it should be used. And we need to create mechanisms by which that process of determining the application of technology is embedded within communities. And on the other hand, the notion that data that is being collected and is available can be used to actually inform communities and allow them to make informed choices, whether it's around public health issues or anything else. And there were a couple of pathways that we talked about. One was, the notion that in order to actually inform public opinion and drive change behavior, you have to use innovative tools with data around storytelling. How do you generate public action by the provision of information and driving behavior change? And then this notion of citizen science and community laboratories as a specific pathway that would equip communities to actually start determining the application of technology. The second idea, which I picked out from the top 6, but wasn't the second one, which I was keen on and thought I'd share with the group, is around digital skills building. The reason I chose it was it's really looking at the question of how do you match economic opportunities with the sort of skills and needs that are out there within any urban context. And what was particularly compelling of that idea to me was the notion that data that exists within an informal economy context is much less well developed, less well understood. It's not just generated by public or official institutions, but has to be horizontally generated. And that there was in there a compelling challenge of how do you use this sort of sensing technology that we've been hearing about in the morning to start gathering information that doesn't sort of exist in a very formal context right now, but is critical to driving new kinds of economic activity, to promoting growth, to enabling livelihoods to be developed within particularly the urban poor communities. And also bringing in more flexible forms of data. So for example, how do you use voice data as a way of something that can be gathered and collated and then used in the context of creating economic opportunities. So the idea of informal economy skills banks or something of that nature was something that I was sort of quite taken by. Just a last word, I know I've got the zeros staring at me. On process, I think like my colleagues have sort of said it all. Very dynamic discussion. The sort of fascinating balance between trying to combine issues, but in doing that, not losing the granularity. And I think that was a challenge, but also it got us to a good place in terms of the quality of some of the ideas that came out. So a very diverse group, very fascinating discussion. I think all 20 of those ideas in some way warrant further consideration before they can really be taken off a shelf. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you. Well, now we're going to turn to you. And I was in the room when some of these ideas were mentioned, and I could feel in the room when for example, digital skills was mentioned, you could feel in the room that that was an idea that was going to have traction. And there were some others that were, I heard in the room that there was real traction for that haven't been mentioned yet by any of the content moderators, partly because there was a clock staring them in the face telling them they didn't have any more time. So the floor is now open to you, and I want you to ask you, when was there an idea or a pathway mentioned in the room, and you could feel, you had a reaction, and you said, wow, that was good, and that hasn't been mentioned yet. So I'd like to just have you tell us any of those ideas in the rooms where you were in, and a microphone will be brought to you, and we'd like to hear what was the idea you heard, or combination of ideas that you heard, that you feel should be mentioned here in our plenary. The floor is open. Well, I'm going to just prime the pump by saying, which group had the just replacement parts, using the MakerBot to do replacement parts? I mean, I'm sitting there, and I spoke to the gentleman afterwards. He said, you know, what about using that MakerBot to get replacement parts? You put an expensive piece of machinery somewhere in one of these villages, you could miss a part, and suddenly you can't use the entire, pump, or you can't. And he said, what about just replacement parts? And I thought that had a lot of votes. I remember it had a lot of votes. So there was one idea that I thought, that's worth mentioning in the plenary. What else? Plus, I spoke to some of the innovators, to Carlo and to Mark, and they said, I heard things there, this is my field, I heard things there that made me really stand up and take notice. So what was that moment for you? Where did you hear an idea that hasn't been mentioned yet? The floor is open. Yes.
Thanks. I was in the 3D printing, the MakerBot, and there were two ideas that weren't mentioned here. One was for post-conflict applications, right, and making prosthetics, and then also being used for community play and creation. So a tool for kind of post-conflict resolution, or pre-conflict, or at any point in the conflict stage. And then the other one was in kind of high school laboratories and using it as a teaching tool, as an equalizer. A lot of times it's really expensive to get the equipment or really good teaching tools for high school science programs and things like that. So across the board, kind of equalizing that and being used for really good teaching tools.
Can you say a word more about the conflict application?
We didn't actually talk about it a whole lot, so that was kind of the extent of the conversation. But I thought that, in particular, the idea of prosthetics, and then the idea of using it as a tool for community play and community creativity.
Great, thank you. Other ideas that you heard that really need to be said in the plenary? Yes. Nick.
There's one that came out that I think we were all kind of into. Which was the idea of using this no-kill meat to deliver vaccines and medicines. Just as a specific thing, I just thought, if they're live vaccines or live medicines that are going through some kind of meat, getting them right into the GI tract is just an interesting way of taking two things and putting them together that are both important.
Wonderful. Yes, that had the word pharmaceutical in it, didn't it, as I recall? Yeah. Other ideas? Yes, sir.
Hi, I was in the DIY technologies, and someone talked about a device that would help particularly the urban poor understand natural resource use, particularly water, both quantity and qualities of water, and the cycles of water through their communities. And that idea could be extended to energy and other essential natural resources that move through communities in a way to help them understand how they're using, and also how other people are using those natural resources in their cities and communities.
Great. And I'm curious, too, if any of you have ideas that didn't fit in your category that you're thinking, oh, I'm going to have to leave here, and because it didn't fit in one of these 4 categories that the foundation picked, I'm going to be leaving home and having to tell my wife or husband this idea. I want to tell this group. What was there an idea that didn't fit in one of these categories that was also breathing in you? Go ahead, sir.
Not in response to that, but one of the other things that came out of the DIY technologies was said by, I forget what, there was like a 3-word capture around it, which was hands-on hardware, and this notion that you could take, effectively replicate what happens in our society around kids hanging out with other kids who play around with electronic equipment, and being able to find ways that you could have communities come together and actually play around with electronic equipment and just see what they can make and learn and understand from those smaller technologies, and then being able to kind of mash up designs, and through that being able to kind of drive an interesting emergent innovation cycle.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes, sir. Right here.
Not specifically idea, but I wanted to make a comment. Fabulous afternoon. But I think that when we started discussing innovation, we really restricted the word innovation, in spite of a wonderful definition which was presented in the morning, to technological innovation. And the whole piece of social acceptance and socialization of that innovation was restricted to the pathway. To me, that particular social acceptance and social mobilization by itself is a very big and important component of innovation. So a generic suggestion that in future, if we really do it, we shouldn't really select 4 ideas which are technological innovation only, but also think about process innovation in socialization of these ideas.
And did you think, which of these ideas you've heard today did you feel had the highest potential, the most positive potential pathway for application, given this issue of social acceptance?
I actually would say that primarily because I was in that group, so I got to explore that idea much more in detail, the 3D printing.
Thank you. Ben wants to comment on that.
The number one idea that came out of our group really wasn't technology. It was how to distribute technology and knowledge around it. So it was a social innovation that it primarily went to, not the gadget itself.
As I understood it, that idea was basically, how do you create a generation of inventors like the ones who were here today? That was the feeling I got. Was that the gist of it?
How do you spread the knowledge so there are more practitioners and more circles of learning? It was also the same with the innovation for karma points. It was, how do you get people to share their knowledge and get rewarded for it? So it didn't have to be technological knowledge. It just it was rewarding the act of sharing.
Right. Evan?
I just want to echo what Benji said, that in our group, really the number one selected innovation was around creating a new community where there wasn't one that existed for. Now, it was a community of technological innovators, but there was a notion that actually there are different strands of researchers working on similar problems that don't often collaborate with one another.
Well, in regard to these 2 ideas, there was one of the groups, and I apologize, I was in all 4, so I'm a little, have a little jet lag. One of the groups talked about, how do you create an open source ethos in a community so that when someone has an innovation, they don't say, oh, I'm going to patent that now and get rich, but they say, oh, I've got something I can share. Which group did that come up in, and where?
I don't know about it. It partly came up in our discussion that you had to line up the incentives.
Right.
That for a lot of engineering companies that are on the track of protecting IP and earning from it, there's no incentive to share, but open source systems gives you that ability to share it and get something from it. Mostly now it's karma points, but companies like Adafruit are proving that you can actually earn from it too.
Ashwin?
It was mentioned in the cities group as well. There was a specific topic around the application of mobile technology for things like reporting service disruptions, et cetera. And one of the issues around that was what would a barrier or potential pathway be, would be ensuring the cost and affordability of per unit. Like, everyone has mobile phones. We can assume that. We have the data to show that. But what might inhibit the use of your personal mobile phone is the cost per use. And is there an open source kind of platform that can be generated that eliminates that cost?
Right. Great. So maybe those comments trigger some other ideas in the audience. Yes, sir.
Just picking up on, hello? Yeah, just picking up on this question of, innovation being limited to technological idea sharing. In the group about no-kill meat, I thought that the cross-sector, community would also include people outside of technology, because there are moral issues related to, and religious issues and community related to meat, right, that have to transcend just the technological innovations.
If I can take the advantage of having the mic close by, just clarifying my comment, what I was talking about, the hierarchy of lexicon. So when you talked about pathway, I realized everyone talked about socialization and social acceptance. But the hierarchy of lexicon created today was innovation
first.
is technology and pathway is socialization. And I was reacting to that lexicon.
Yeah, what I hear you calling for, and let's see if I've really heard you, is you're really saying social innovation is extremely important, and there should be a place for a conversation in which social innovation comes first rather than second. I should just say that the Rockefeller Foundation is very aware of that. Today happened to be focused on technology, but there's a heavy emphasis in the foundation on starting with social innovation as well. But thank you for that point. It's extremely important. Other comments? Other ideas you heard? Because I'm now, yes, in the back, and then I want to ask you an even more challenging question.
One of the related ideas to the Skills Bank is the idea of a telenation. Many countries have some of their best minds outside of their countries, and there's not an easy way for them to give back other than money. But just like we have computer dating for people, imagine countries put together their needs in some website in some way, and the ambassadors, the UN here, call their people together in various national clubs, whether they're Macedonian or wherever, Zimbabwe, and then they match them up so that you can actually, because after all, the innovations doesn't have to be in a geographic location anymore.
Thank you. I like your idea. So I was asking about ideas in your group that you hadn't heard. What about some shared themes? As you heard the 4 content moderators speak, and as you've heard your colleagues speak, are there any shared themes or shared lessons that you're getting, regardless of what the technology is? You're hearing a shared theme that really needs to be highlighted because it cuts across all of those areas. Anybody? Yes, in red.
I think one big theme that I keep hearing about is this idea of building communities that can innovate and communities that can keep sort of riffing on these incredible technologies that have been presented to us.
Yeah, I want to echo that. There was definitely the theme of continual iteration. One of the speakers spoke about standing on the shoulders, and I heard a lot of that in the room. It's not like we invented this, isn't it great? But we've invented, 1.0, and someone else in the community comes up with 2.0 and 3.0, and there's a constant evolution, which I think is extremely important. Yes, there's another one here.
Just to build on that and abstract maybe one level higher is, I think that there's sort of this notion around an enabling environment for innovation to happen, which so many of these ideas that actually came out at the top speak to. So they talk about cross-sector collaboration and what are the incentives for that to happen when right now we have a lot of incentives that cause siloing. Right. When we talk about sort of people interacting with technology and ideas in a way that gives them the space to test things out and to take risks and fail lots. What are the financial incentives for them to do so? We had lots of conversations in our group, and I see it here as well. And how do you capture the results of tests and hypotheses and trials? And how do you have all the incentives associated with that? So it's really those are the enabling, and that's the enabling environment for innovation, which I think that there's a thirst for, especially within the developing country development context that I don't think exists as much as it could.
Mark, if I may. Sorry, Mark, can I just hop in, skipping over here?
Please, yes, and I see 3 hands. We'll come to you in just a moment.
Right. I just want to thank you both for saying those things about the enabling environment and about the communities of practice or communities and networks, because a key piece for the foundation is to think about innovation as a capacity as opposed to innovation as a noun and a thing. And so the way in which you've described it, I think, you captured it beautifully, but that is part of what we're really looking at is how do we build the capacity for innovation in an ongoing way way across sectors in both the developed and the developing world to ensure that when we're facing the kinds of problems that shape shift over time, we have the capacity to adapt and iterate and create the next solution.
Thank you. So I saw 3 hands. Well, now there's 5. Could you keep your hands up, the 5 of you? Oh my God, now there's 9. I want to give Zia a chance to speak for just a moment. So could we take 2 or 3 people, and then I'm going to ask Zia to comment on what he's heard. So in the back, then you, sir, with the beard, and there was 1 hand right here. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So I was in Ashwin's group, and I felt like our group was really solution-oriented, and at the beginning of this report back, something that one of the panelists said really struck me, which is that we should use data we should use technology to collect data and work with people to identify the problems. And I was really enamored with this idea of using mobile technology to connect people, and hearing that statement about using technology to collect data had a light bulb moment for me, and thinking about all the data that just can be passively collected by mobile technology. Of course, in our group, somebody raised the whole Big Brother issue. You have to have a lot of trust in government, but to me, that's just in this conversation, that's something that's been connected for me, is using mobile data. Even if you don't know what the problem is, it doesn't matter, because you can work with people remotely to identify it.
Thank you.
Speaking to your question about themes throughout, and I think the biggest one, I was in the MakerBot group, education as a whole. First of all, education of what the technologies are, understanding context, but then as we went through talking a lot of the pieces of education of those communities so that they know how not only to use the tools, but we have to step way before that it exists, and even understanding what it can do. So I think probably going through each of the groups, there was a lot of exploratory learning between what the technology is good for, what maybe not so good for. I know we had a lot of ideas that we put out. It may not have been the best application for the device. I think it's really important that we don't look at trying to solve every problem with a technology or a device. Let's identify more of the problems and then go backwards and say what devices work for that, as opposed to saying this device would do X, Y, and Z.
Great, thank you. And this lady right here in the aisle.
Thanks. I was in the no-kill meat section, but as I've been listening to this conversation, I realized what was resonating for me is some of the conversation around translational research that's happening in the microbiology institutes, meaning that there's a whole lot of basic research going on that then gets translated in these ways through both technical innovation and social innovation. And to put it in the no-kill meat context, I think of that more as challenges of production and challenges of consumption, and that on the production side, if you think about translational research, it gets to the heart of this question of what's going on, for example, in biofuels or single-cell technology or whatever, that actually applies here to growing no-kill meat on structures. And then on the social side, the consumption side, if you will, what's going on that we can learn from other sectors, which is really about how to install products, or how to create product acceptance in communities in which perhaps, I suppose by definition, it's not really been traditionally there because it hasn't existed before. So there may be some learning that we can do as well from the folks who are really focused on translational research.
Thank you. I'm going to just comment on one of these last ideas and share one that I heard, and then ask Zia to tell us what he's heard, because he's been, like me, floating from group to group, and as vice president for the foundation, probably sees better than any of us what's the interface between some of the ideas you've come up with and what the foundation's thinking about. The education idea I wanted to underscore, because there's a lot of, we're very aware that in the Muslim world and a lot of the madrasas, there's a lot of memorization. But it's true in many schools around the world. It's education for memorization, not education for innovation. And that's a very different kind of education. So I underscore that comment about education. And then I want to I'm reminded that when I worked in the Soviet Union in the 80s, a colleague of mine started something, and there'd been that Soviet control of the society, and he started something after the collapse of the sort of Soviet Union. There was perestroika. He started something called the Foundation for Social Innovation. And basically he said, look, we've been a totalitarian society. This is a new historical moment. We need to innovate. And they had a foundation that had money, and they really rewarded ideas for innovation from the larger public. You could send your ideas there, and there's something about the Foundation for Social Innovation that I feel I feel in a way the Rockefeller Foundation is starting to do that. They're creating a foundation for social innovation, and you are all part of it. And I just want to underscore that idea that it came up in one of the groups. Somebody said a contest or a karma bank, or someone had it was basically, let's create a forum that we can put ideas in and people can vote on them and see which of them really deserve investment. So that idea of crowdsourcing and crowd wisdom really seems to me to be important, because in a way the world, when it comes to climate change and a few other things, is in the same place now the Soviet Union was then. You know, it's like we need to reinvent ourselves. How do we produce goods without polluting? How do we do a number of things in totally new ways? So I just want to underscore those two ideas. Zia.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I want to thank all of you and my colleagues for such a thoughtful and provocative discussion. So the first observation I'd like to make is it was really interesting to hear in all the breakout groups and also in this discussion the interplay between problems and solutions. I think in classic training, and I spent a lot of time as an engineer, you always taught start with a problem and find a solution, and we believe in that. But I think we lose sight of all the solutions out there that if we reframe them to think about what problems could they be applied to, we already have those solutions, and it's just going in the reverse direction. So this notion of moving in two directions between problems and solutions, I think is a really interesting way to take a lot of inventions that are happening for one reason and then redirecting them to another reason, which in our purpose and our mission is around improving the well-being of poor and vulnerable people. So that interplay was very interesting to observe as a process. And then secondly, I'm probably just restating really what everyone else has already commented on, is this notion of what I would call inventions and the technology and the nuts and bolts as they interact with humans. And the science and discipline that goes into inventing things is not always the same mental discipline that goes into thinking about how do people use these things. So elements like emotion I heard a lot about in terms of ownership and learning badges and the pride and motivation that comes with that. The reorganization of organizational processes and communities and collaboration. And then ownership. How do we create ownership by communities and open source ownership? These are all things that are emotional, that need deep understanding of the context and of the people, and can't be so easily replicated as a blueprint plan for some of these technologies. So I think integrating these two things is a real challenge around the analytic engineering discipline, around creating things that are powerful, and I was just so impressed by hearing the talks these mornings. And I actually live on Dean Street in Brooklyn right next to the MakerBot factory, so now I have a way to break in there and try and play with some of the toys. The discipline there, plus just the empathy and the anthropology of understanding what is it that poor and vulnerable people need, how is it that they're going to apply those technologies. So that was also very encouraging and something for us to keep in mind as well as we build towards social innovation versus technical invention.
Beautiful, thank you. I'd like to give the content moderators any final opportunity to say any final thoughts you have based on the experience this afternoon.
I think it was a great experience in people coming, as Skippy said, people willing to come up with ideas and willing to revise those ideas. One of the things that happened in our group was, I'll take that idea and add on to this. And there was so a lot of that aggregated in. There was also the pain of having to cut out certain ideas because you had to choose, and there was a few good ideas there, which I think goes back to what Zia said, that there's a lot of good ideas and solutions. It's integrating them and finding new ways to put them together that would bring new insights.
I just go back to the devil's in the details, right? And I think we all know that. And so, again, the spirit of participation today, I think reflected that the hard work is in figuring out, do any of these ideas hold water when they go into a specific context with a specific challenge and a group of beneficiaries that need to essentially own it and develop it on their own. But again, the ability of everyone in the room to take what was on the table as a task and not overcomplicate it, right? Not problematize it in ways that were unhelpful, but in fact to do so in ways that took us towards a generic brainstorming session. I do want to reiterate that it was said before, but I think everybody in this room understands that this cycle of innovation starts usually with ideation. Sometimes it starts a little bit before that with a problem diagnosis or a need. Sometimes it starts in the middle with some kind of a prototype. But it is a full cycle that gets all the way through, hopefully, to achieving some kind of tangible and eventually systemic change. So this early stage of ideation is just one part of the way in which the foundation hopes to work on innovation.
So I have sort of two thoughts in thinking through this. The first is that I was really impressed by the way that people thought across different timescales. So I think what's reflected in all of our points and from the comments from the groups are that people were thinking 6 months out, a year out, 5 years out, 10, 20, 30 years out, and that the conversation really spanned those different time dimensions, which really impressed me. The second sort of idea, and this goes back a little bit to what Zia said, but it also seems to me that this era of thinking about technology alone is sort of passing, that I think nobody came to the table thinking that the technology itself can do it, that it's not just the invention alone, as Zia said, but I think that's a pretty seismic shift in thinking about the role of technology in development. I mean, it's easy to understate, it might seem natural, it might seem trivial, but I don't think that was the case decades ago. And it's sort of exciting for me to think about that people don't always now have to go back to this notion that technology alone can solve problems, that there are a whole other set of social factors and social determinants that really are quite important.
Since we're all making a final comment, I guess building on the social dimension, the thing that's circling around in my head now is also around sort of the politics of information. And so much of what was discussed in our group was the notion of technology being an enabling democratization of information, and then the use of information in a way that can empower. But there's also, so it's not just about whether people and communities are willing to adopt and use new technologies that give them that information, but it's also then understanding how is that actually going to interface with the political system that exists, or the governance system that exists. So much of what we talked about was around how can we use information to drive better governance. But what is that really going to take in addition to the technology and the social change?
So I'm curious, to put my colleagues on the spot here for a moment, as we think about the purpose of these events is not so much just to talk, but actually start doing things. And realizing that you have your own lines of work and programmatic areas, is there something that you heard today that actually influenced your thinking in terms of a new idea for work that you're currently doing, or a new question to ponder, or a new problem, a new way of looking at things? If you could just discuss some brief thoughts about what that work is and what provokes your thinking differently as we think of all the ways that we can incorporate the outcomes and outputs of these discussions into what we do going forward.
Okay. It's hard to pin down any one thing. One of the things I do a lot of work on is actually on cities and climate change, and looking at the impact of climate change on poor and vulnerable communities within cities. And I think we have just begun to scratch the surface on how technology can be applied more effectively in that sort of context, where we have a very rapidly changing environment. People don't necessarily understand. The information and data is not available, and the ability to act on information is not necessarily available. So even if you take something as simple as early warning systems, how can we integrate some of the technology innovations that I've been sort of hearing about today more into that work? So that's one sort of concrete takeaway for me.
So I'll answer that. So I help to manage a network of organizations around the world that do regular horizon scanning and trend monitoring to help us understand where the world is going and understand from the point of view of people living around the developing world, what are the interesting challenges and problems that they see from their points of view. So one of the things that today really made me think about is asking that network for examples about how new types of technologies are being rolled out on the ground today. Because I think it's really interesting to get a sense of what's happening today with a lot of these new technologies, whether it's these four or others, to get a sense of where that adoption process is headed over the coming years. So that might be a request that I send around pretty quickly, actually.
So the team that I work on at the foundation is actually specifically concerned with social innovation. And so it's not to say that we shy away from the technologists, but we are much more focused on the capacity for innovation that may include the generation of some technologies or the use of them, but doesn't start there. So what we found is that in comparison to the infrastructure for technological innovation, the infrastructure for social innovation is not only weak, in many parts of the world it's non-existent. And so one of our backdoor ways of trying to stimulate policymaker conversations about this kind of infrastructure is to really look to the examples of and to infiltrate the networks of science, technology, and innovation people around the world is specifically concentrated in different regions. And so I think the conversation today made me very hopeful, as Evan was saying, that the two communities are not that far apart. Those who are focused on technological innovation are more and more concerned with the inclusive benefits of those technologies, the inclusive development benefits, and equally that social innovators are increasingly looking to technology or specific platforms and processes to help jumpstart some of the work that they want to do to realize lasting, impactful change.
It's not something I work on directly, but there's a team in the foundation that is on securing livelihoods. And these little things, and it's been an idea that's been bouncing around the foundation in my head. These little things are badges that Adafruit gives out. This one is for soldering. If you learn to solder on a project, you get the badge. This one is metric. If you learn metric, you get the badge. This one seems to be robotics. And so if you learn robotics. And so the idea that there may be an alternative model for getting training to get livelihoods, where you don't have to spend the 4 years in high school or 6 years in high school to get a high school degree, then an associate degree, that you learn as you go using technologies, but figuring out how to aggregate all of that so that people see it. And in this very network world where your Facebook presence is indelible, and there's, whatever you tweet 3 years ago is probably still around. Can we use these kinds of badges to, as an alternative way of preparing people for livelihoods?
That's very interesting, Benji. And as I look retrospectively on my PhD in engineering, I think the badges would have been more useful to my livelihood after I left. So that's a great recap, and I appreciate all of your thinking already about how to incorporate these ideas. And just as a reminder, what we plan to do is we're working with our partners at IDEO to take some of the input from this discussion, really think it through, put it through the machine, grind it in many different ways, and see what are the most interesting pieces that pop out that we can help support in terms of funding challenges for ideas, or maybe there's deliberate work that we want to do in our grant funding, or incorporate it into our current work as we're always on the frontiers of new problems. So, I can't say exactly what will be happening, but in that very cool report that will be coming out that I mentioned earlier, we hope to report on some of the actual actions that we're taking, because we really want to honor all the time and commitment you put here to share your ideas to make sure we get the most value out of those ideas and put them to the best use.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. And I just want to say a closing word and maybe invite anybody else from Rockefeller or IDEO to comment if they wish. That the next stage of this process that the Rockefeller Foundation, with IDEO supporting them, is going to take on, really takes this conversation further. And I want to just say from my heart why I feel it's so important. That I happen to have close colleagues in China who monitor CO2 emissions. And the CO2 emissions in China are skyrocketing. And there's a vast market out there that's encouraging the Chinese middle class to buy automobiles and to continue that spiral of CO2 emissions. The market is going to make sure that certain innovations spread. That's what the market does. If you have money, you can buy an innovation, like my iPhone in my pocket. The question is, how are those innovations really help the poor and vulnerable? And so I just want to honor and acknowledge again the Rockefeller Foundation for recognizing that unless various institutions, both private and public, step forward and create incentives for innovation that actually supports the environment and supports economic justice, the market will do what it normally does, which is to spread it to the rich or powerful, but there needs to be other forces that make sure they spread to the poor and vulnerable. So I want to acknowledge the Rockefeller Foundation, and then I want to acknowledge IDEO because I've done a lot of work. Most of my work has been around Democratic and Republican dialogues and trying to get politicians to work together. And so it's very refreshing to come and work here. Very refreshing about the design experience here, because here, in those small groups, there was none of that energy. It was, how can I build on your idea? And what IDEO specializes in, it specializes in design breakthroughs. It specializes in fulfilling Einstein's wish, you know, can't solve problems on the same level of awareness that created them. So that design feeling is the opposite of what I would call the partisan experience, which is you come up with a good idea and you're not of my party, I try to undercut it. And even if it is a good idea, it doesn't end up coming through Congress as a good idea because we're divided against each other. So the spirit of the Rockefeller Foundation and the spirit of IDEO and the spirit of this gathering gives me a lot of hope and energy. And my challenge to all of us, including, as I told my colleagues from IDEO, is how can we take this spirit to Washington? How can we take this design energy, this problem-solving energy into the political system? Because we need it desperately. We need it desperately. And I want to just ask anybody who's from Rockefeller or IDEO if you want to make any closing comment before we bring this panel to a close. Anybody? You all good? Great. Well, thank you very much. There's going to be a short break, and then we'll begin the next panel. Thank you, and thank you, everybody.